Morning everybody, Bordar, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm Oriel Miller, I'm the Director of the IWA, and we are Wales' leading independent think tank. We're with a long track record of shaping debates, influencing change in Wales through policy and research and advocacy. Our online and print publications, this is the latest edition of the Welsh Agenda, which provide platforms for comment and debate in our agenda-setting events like today's. We're a membership organisation, and it's great to see so many members here today, members across the country and far further afield as well. We're funded by our members, the events we run ourselves, and by independent trusts and foundations. What makes us special is that we bridge public, private, third sector, academia and community groups, and we bridge policy areas too. Our research and policy focus on what does a strong, confident democracy look and feel like? How do we ensure high-performing, responsive public services? And what does a clean, green and fair economy for Wales look like? This conversation today has stemmed from a number of conversations we've been having with our members and partners over the last few weeks. What we've been hearing from them is that an open, politically independent and inclusive space for discussion and debate is a really good way to identify the longer term challenges that we face in Wales because of COVID-19 and to work out where the opportunities for real lasting change are. We believe that we are really well placed in the current climate to bring those voices together. We're conscious that normally lots of people would be meeting up and exchanging ideas, experiences and reflections in person. And at that moment, that's just not possible for so many of us. Those who are involved in the emergency health and care response or the essential services that are keeping people alive right now and keeping services going while we're all in lockdown will rightly be focused on their immediate and practical priorities. What we want to focus on is noticing what we're all learning from a policy perspective and sharing that learning where it's useful. We're finding it helpful to think in 4 different ways. Firstly, noticing what's happening. What are the impacts on people's day-to-day lives and organisations supporting them? What are the new policy responses so far? What unintended negative consequences do we need to try to mitigate? And how do we start shaping what the policy priorities are for the future? We're interested in listening to perspectives, experiences and views from emerging as well as established thinkers and commentators. We're anticipating that this series will grow and develop as we go along, and we're learning by doing. What are we going to do with it? We plan to use this engagement as the basis of some substantive partnership work to develop long-term policy ideas for post-COVID-19 Wales. And we're already having conversations about how we capture, share and disseminate all that learning. We're absolutely delighted to have so many of you joining us today at only 2 days' notice. So we think we've really hit the sweet spot in terms of timing. We'd love to continue this conversation online. So do please feel free to tweet using hashtag Rethinking Wales throughout the session and in the next few weeks. Now there's some housekeeping issues which we've adapted for these sorts of things. Normally we'd be saying no mobile phones, please. Can you remember to put them on silent? But actually on Zoom on this session, participants are going to be muted by the host. And we're going to use the sidebar chat for questions. Please put your questions to the panel throughout the Q&A to the moderator. And please use the sidebar to send the moderator a question by using the drop-down arrow so that it says to moderator. Please remember that everything that you write in the chat sidebar is recorded and there's a transcript of it afterwards. And we're going to be keeping strictly to 1 hour, so we will be finishing by midday. The hashtag is Rethinking Wales. And just as a slight thing, I really hope you all know where your fire exits and toilets are, okay? If you need to nip out and get a cup of tea and come back, totally fine. So today we're talking about what does Wales need to be thinking about in the long term. I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Rachel Bowen, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Colegau Cymru, which represents the further education sector in Wales. Professor Laura McAllister, who's Professor of Public Policy and the Governance of Wales at the Wales Governance Centre, Cardiff University, and also a member of the RWA board. Stuart Ropke, who's the Chief Exec of Community Housing Cymru, the representative body for housing associations in Wales, and Rebecca Woolley, who's the Director of Citizens Advice Cymru. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We're going to ask each panellist to speak for 5 minutes on the following question. In the current climate and in relation to the coronavirus and COVID-19, what does Wales need to be thinking about in the long term? I'm going to start with Rachel, so I'm going to come to you first, then Laura, then Stuart, and then Becca. So, Rachel, Over to you, please.
Thanks for the invitation to join you today and to take part in the panel. So, as Oriel said, I work in further education policy, but for anybody who follows me on Twitter, you'll know that I do a little bit of running as well. And I'm not the only one. I seem to have seen quite a lot of people taking their daily form of promoted exercise as running. And it got me thinking that one of the slogans of Adidas used to be, "Impossible is nothing." And if we think about where we are now compared to where we were before Christmas, with millions of people working from home, the end of face-to-face teaching in schools, colleges and universities, most shops are closed, all sporting fixtures are cancelled, we've seen homeless people housed, GP services have moved online, the government is paying 80% of wages in many industries. We would have thought that none of this was possible, but actually the impossible is possible. Impossible is nothing. In terms of further education sector and education in general, and how we're going to react to the crisis, what we need to think about long term, I'd just like to make 2 points. The first one is about digital and online teaching and assessment, and this is about apprenticeships, so not just kind of traditional courses that we think of, but also those work-based learning courses. Lots of provision was already online. There was already lots of excellent work going on in terms of online tuition, online courses in the further education sector. But as we look to deal with the impact of COVID-19 and look for the opportunities, we can try to develop this further and hopefully bring in new swathes of people in terms of making it possible for them to reskill, upskill, reach different people, maybe work better in terms of rural provision if people no longer have to travel, because we're all used to not travelling now, or getting used to not travelling. It's not to say that I don't think there's going to be a role for human contact in terms of teaching, assessment, provision in the future, but we can think about how to make the most of the changes we've all sought to implement very, very quickly. But of course, not everyone has got the same access to online opportunities, whether that's in terms of teaching or whether that's in terms of accessing any other kinds of services. There's a real inequality angle here and a real focus on poverty. So how do we make sure in the future that everyone has access, not just to Wi-Fi, but to the kit that makes connecting to Wi-Fi, to taking part in learning possible? How can we reach Black and minority ethnic communities more effectively? How can we make sure that online provision is suitable for people with all sorts of disabilities? How can we make sure that online provision, which was expanding anyway, but actually now reaches different people in a more accessible way, gives people the courses for the skills that they're going to need in the future? And that takes me on to my second point, which is the kinds of skills Wales is going to need long term. We've seen in recent months that the key workers aren't necessarily those people who are valued widely by society, certainly not in terms of pay. So we have lots of people working in health and social care. We have lots of people who are on the front line now, whose wages are barely minimum wage, who haven't been traditionally valued. But we know that these skills are incredibly important, not just in the middle of a crisis, but with an ageing population. Wales is going to constantly need health and social care workers and good quality provision. We want Wales to be a place where people can grow old happily, safely, and live fulfilling lives. We also need to think about other industries, so teaching. I'm sure there's a lot of parents right now who are getting used to having to look after children, maybe throw in a bit of English and maths and goodness knows whatever else kind of your children are studying. So, kind of how do we make sure that our teachers of the future are able to deliver things online? How can we support parents? In terms of manufacturing skills, we may want to look at shortening supply chains in some cases. We may need to make sure that equipment such as personal protective equipment, which is a big issue right now, is manufactured closer to home to make sure that we can deal with these kinds of things. And in terms of the expansion in physical activity, there certainly seem to be a lot more people who've taken up walking, cycling and going for the occasional run. Sports science courses in further education are often spoken about quite pejoratively, but if there's an opportunity to build on the levels of physical activity that we see after the crisis, maybe there's a role for people doing sports science to pick up and build on, hopefully, a new enthusiasm for being out and about and doing things. And then just to finish, it's not inevitable that after the crisis, things won't go back to the old normal. And while lots of us are looking forward to doing normal things again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to go back to the old inequalities. If we want positive change after the crisis, we're all responsible for making it happen. And so having started with Adidas's impossible is nothing, I think I'm going to end with Nike's just do it. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Rachel. There's some really interesting themes coming through there, which we'll pick up in the panel conversation. Laura, I'm going to come to you next. One of the things that we're noticing, obviously, is how decisions are being made by different governments and affecting different parts of the UK differently. Can you talk us through some of those issues, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Oriel. Bore da, pawb. Yeah, my comments will follow on quite well, I think, from Rachel's, in that I wanted to talk about the kind of high level political public decision making sphere, really, and what we've learned and what we might want to do differently when we come through the worst of this crisis. And, you know, obviously, having had so many things cancelled in lots of our diaries, it has, at the very least, despite all the rest of the things we've had to contend with, given us some time to read again and read around things again. And one of the things I was rereading recently was some of the American literature around the so-called Overton Window. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but it's a kind of centre-right think tank idea from the 1990s that there's a scale of public decision-making interventions, and they tend to happen within the centrist window. So the two ends of the scale are always excluded when it comes to decision-making. And of course, one of the things about a crisis is that it opens up the whole of the window. You know, in a sense, you're blasting open that window, and you can think at every extreme, really. Now, there's a risk with that, of course, because it brings in some weird and wonderful and potentially damaging ideas as well. But the benefit of it is that it's a radical blueprint. So instead of binning some of the ideas that are deemed too radical and too ambitious to actually consider, which is what most governments do effectively, they operate in the middle of the Overton window. A crisis like coronavirus now gives us an opportunity to think very differently. So in terms of, you know, my area of politics and the public sphere, I think what it's shown for me really is that it's destroyed any vestiges of kind of neoliberal thinking that this is the only way of doing things. I think the whole discussions around society and community and care for our neighbours and community and regard for each other and respect and blatant inequalities, whether that's in terms of pay and, you know, for our care workers and supplies, as Rachel said a moment ago, or whether it's to do with the kind of nonsense that we've all pretty much absorbed about the status of certain jobs and positions vis-a-vis others. So I think, you know, in that sense, it's there's a big positive there that can help us, but I do think we're going to have to change the whole culture of operation here. I mean, Wales, probably more than anywhere I've ever worked, is essentially lacking a kind of natural self-belief. We've seen that exposed in some of the conversations around how the Welsh government is doing vis-a-vis the UK government. We've seen it in some of the resurrection of the kind of abolitionists around devolution recently. And I think we need to have those conversations much more openly, really. We need to talk about what the new society will look like and what the new politics will look like. And when I talk about culture and behaviour, when I think about culture and behaviour, the things that have struck me most during this period is how quickly things can happen when we need them to happen quickly. And that's a good lesson to us about how slow our behavioural culture has become. You know, we have a default position, I think, not just in Wales, this is the public sector pretty much everywhere, where things will take 3 years to do because of the bureaucracy and consultation around them. But in this, we've cut through a lot, excuse me, of that bureaucracy, and we've cut straight to the chase of actually doing things, whether that's whether that's around homelessness or building the new field hospitals or making decisions and so on. So it's shown that we can do it, but we're going to need to keep up that momentum. And part of keeping up that momentum will be to have a much more challenging culture where we are much more attuned to accepting criticism and scrutiny and people who think differently to us. We've got to stop the coziness of Wales and the kind of belief that there is one way of doing things, and anybody who isn't from our small p political persuasion shouldn't come around the table. And I think whatever we do as an Institute of Welsh Affairs now, we've got to listen to some of the voices that have been excluded before. And actually, some of those might be on the centre right, or they may be from Black and minority communities, or maybe from rural areas, maybe from young people. But I think we've really got to open this door. You know, the Overton window has been blasted open. I think we've got to open the Welsh door now and bring in people to the conversation who can be constructively critical, but also have a vision of how we might do things fundamentally different in the future.
Thanks very much, Laura. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of providing spaces for different voices to be heard. And we're on the case with that in terms of the new voices chunk of our website, but also going out proactively and seeking people who've got things that they want to share. Next, I'm going to come to Stuart. Stuart, tell us about how things are going for housing associations.
Thanks, Oriel. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I think we're actually at a really timely moment in the evolution of this crisis to start talking about this stuff. It feels like the month that we've just been through has been about the crisis management, frankly, making sure that essential services are still being delivered, emergency services on the ground, communities are being supported. And yes, I think a lot of the answers to how things will work in the crisis are now there, and that things just happen. Yes, there's still issues. I know we've picked up already on PPE and supply in this conversation, and certainly for housing associations in the care business in particular, that has been and remains just an incredible issue to overcome. Really, really worrying in lots of ways. But I think we are now at the moment where we do need to start looking to the future and what this might mean. And I'll be honest, on a personal level, I sort of have moments where I'm optimistic that the crisis we are going through will see positive change at the end of it. But I also have moments when I think, actually, we might just drift back to what was normal and miss that opportunity. And a lot depends on how we exit from lockdown, I guess, and what measures might remain in place as we ease down and how long that will be. But I still don't think that's settled. So the questions I'm sort of asking myself, and I think we're asking our members and others are, if we have a public policy environment post-crisis where the focus surely will be on health and well-being in the round, how do we ensure that access to good quality affordable housing is the cornerstone of how which all of the policy interventions can then be laid? There's a reason I work in housing, and I've worked in housing for 25 years, because I was interested in public policy. And when I looked at public policy, to me, it wasn't about education, it was housing, actually, for me. I always felt at the absolute heart of public policy and ensuring that people can make the most of the opportunities that were presented to them, but also build a solid and sustainable life on that. So how do we make that sure? And another question then that comes from that is, if work and patterns of work and indeed patterns of education, as Rachel picked up on, change, as many are predicting as a result of the crisis, how then do we ensure that the homes that we build, or even the homes we renovate and other things, are designed to allow those to live in them to access opportunities across the whole economy? We're quite privileged, actually. I think most of us on this panel, or all of us, are in the knowledge economy, really. It's not that difficult for us to, in some ways, to work from home if you've got the space available. It's not always easy for others. And actually, if the economy is going to move to that, how do we ensure that opportunities are there for everybody? We had a conversation, actually, with the Welsh Government even 3, 4, 5 months ago, which is about the standards that affordable housing needs to be in the future. And a lot about that, actually, was should they be digitally connected? And at the time, it wasn't made mandatory. It didn't feature in the standards. I wonder if we were having that conversation today, whether we might change what we might do there. I also think we've got a real challenge in Wales as well. Clearly outside of the major urban centres in particular, we know that Wales' economy is amongst the poorest in Europe. We know that our population is amongst the oldest, and it suffers from some really debilitating long-term health conditions. We've seen the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, this week predicting that the fallout could be the worst depression in over a century. That would be absolutely devastating to communities across the length and breadth of Wales. Now, for me, actually, there is a traditional solution to that, and it's the need for a hard-hitting programme of economic stimulus. And again, working in housing, it's absolutely unthinkable that the building of new homes and the renovation of our existing stock wouldn't be part of that answer. So how do we ensure we're geared up and ready to go with a supply chain that's at the ready, a supply chain actually that has been under pressure during this crisis, and also an army of workers ready to spring into action? But so there's reason for hope and positivity, but I don't think we've yet won the policy debate, or we've decided where the policy direction should go on the end of this. I hear the airwaves abounding, mainly with English politicians, I have to say, but the airwaves abounding with the sound of politicians opining that the unparalleled government interventions that we've seen in the last month have got to be paid for. Now, we all know, I think, what that is code for, given the financial crisis of 2008. And we know that austerity brought many people and communities to their knees. And, you know, I fail to see how we can let that same mistake happen again. It would be surely unthinkable for government to turn off the tap of funding and support just at the time when they'll be needed most, which is actually beyond this crisis, beyond, you know. So we need to be on the front foot in making the case to both national and local governments. But other reasons for hope, I think millions of people have turned to the welfare system for support in their hour of need. And surely now, if at any time, the reality of a dysfunctional safety net and a clear case for reform is there, given that people have now experienced that en masse. It's already been mentioned, we've found housing and accommodation for many thousands of rough sleepers. Again, has to be unthinkable that when the immediate health crisis ends, that they're just evicted back onto the streets. Absolutely unconscionable. And our health service, which has been clearly overstretched, has geared up incredibly rapidly and quickly to deal with that influx of seriously ill patients. And, you know, again, how can we ever let it run near to the knuckle in the future? Now, we've got elections in Wales, haven't we, in 2021 to what will be the Welsh Parliament. Again, how can any political party put forward a programme for the people of Wales in the aftermath of this crisis that is not genuinely far-reaching and radical, that address the weaknesses in our society that COVID-19 have really illustrated for us all to see? And I think those challenges are bigger than any single politician or any single political party. So we all need to raise our voices in that way. And just to pick up, I finish on one of Laura's points around devolution. I think that the current crisis has writ large for me the weaknesses in the current devolution settlement. Even practical stuff on the ground, guidance issued in the morning from the UK government, which might be about social care, it might be about the standards of personal protection equipment that are needed in different settings. The UK government guidance, it applies to England, it's a devolved area. We then see confusion about whether it applies to Wales or not. Welsh government reacts, they essentially copy and paste it and reissue it later with some small changes, which cause confusion. I've seen UK government put stuff out on social media about the support available to businesses and individuals, which talks about the two governments in Wales. No, we haven't got two governments, we've got one government, actually. I just think the whole devolution settlement has been stretched here, almost beyond breaking point for me, because of the confusion that abounds between where UK government guidance applies, where Welsh government applies. And you know, the people on this panel, we all work in the devolved world. We are probably better equipped than most to know what is devolved, what is reserved to Westminster, and where the balance lies. And I just think it's been an absolute world of confusion. I actually think, you know, on a personal level, I think the case for clearer devolution, more devolution has been made. We need to take responsibility. But you know, except for what Laura said, there'll be voices in the other direction which suggest that we should go back to more centralisation. And I do think we now have to have that debate properly, because it has been a weakness in this crisis, the interface between UK and Welsh government.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Stuart. Plenty of food for thought in that. Becca, over to you. There's a nice segue, I think, particularly into the crushingly obvious issue about inequalities. So tell us about CAB.
Yeah, there really is. Yeah, and thanks to Stuart, you've sort of teed up a couple of things really nicely for me that I'd wanted to say here. So yeah, thanks for having me on the call today. I think it's really, really important stuff. So Stuart alluded to this already, and I think the long-term picture in Wales, as elsewhere, will depend in part on how quickly this sort of lockdown period ends, and also how we exit from it. And into the future, whether similar kind of restrictions recur for us at certain points in time. And primarily for us at Citizens Advice, that's because that obviously restricts people's movement outside of their homes, and that affects people's ability to earn and to work. So already we've seen a huge impact in this crisis so far on people's income and their finances. So we know that around 4 out of 10 people have seen their household incomes reduced because of the crisis, and then that percent of their income fall away. Again, Stuart's alluded to the impact on the social welfare system. Around half of the people who are coming to us for in-person support are seeking help with universal credit, and it won't be a surprise to anybody. You've seen it all in the press, the impact that that has then on the systems and processes that we have in place, even for ensuring that people can get access to universal credit. So employment is a huge part of this for people, and in the longer term, I think this is one of the key areas where we're going to see a real issue in Wales. I think the package of measures that we've seen from the UK government around this is really welcome, but we're already seeing people slipping through the gaps. And I think, again, looking to the longer term in Wales, that creates a real problem. So we're seeing employers choosing not to use the job retention scheme, for example, and instead making people redundant. So that creates a long-term problem where there could actually have been a temporary problem. Also, many people who come to us are really confused about their rights at work anyway, and now you have temporary measures and longer term policy measures being put in place. It's very, very hard to stay abreast of those changes, and so people are even more confused about what their rights are than usual, particularly if they have very complex situations. And actually what you find when you delve into it is that everybody's situation is complex. It's just everyone is different. And again, Stuart touched on this, but one of the particularly significant issues in Wales, of course, is that we know that the financial and economic backdrop for this was tough already. And we have to remember that, of course, this crisis in some geographical areas in Wales, this came hard on the heels of Storm Dennis. You know, we already had a lack of resilience in the system. So before this pandemic was even something that we were talking about, let alone in the midst of, we as Citizens Advice knew that more than 400,000 people in Wales have no savings at all, and that 1 in 8 adults would be unable to pay their household outgoings for more than a week if their income fell away. And we are now in the midst of what that really feels like day to day for people. And I think it's useful to try and touch in on the really, really human bit. And I think one of the ways I'd like to do that is just to say that one of the highest visited pages on our website at the moment is, I can't fund my prepayment meter due to coronavirus. And that gives us all pause for thought. The implications of that are, of course, massive. And if this recurs, or we find measures in place that bring us all into our own homes again on an ongoing basis, on and off, the impact of that for people is gigantic, particularly as we move into the winter and you look at the effect of that on things like fuel poverty and people's ability to feed their families warm food when the weather outside is not as glorious as it is for us all today. So we will see people's household arrears and finances backed up. There's a backlog that's going on here that is in part being held at bay like a dam because of these temporary measures that have been put into place. And one of the things that we are really focused on at the moment in our organisation is, and I'm sure others are as well, is what happens when that dam opens and, you know, the floodgates are open and actually those temporary measures are lifted. These problems haven't gone away for people, and actually their financial situation has got far more complex in the meantime, and suddenly we will have to deal with a whole load of new demand as well as pent-up demand, which is really, really complex for people. And I guess I'd like to just finally end by saying that I loved Rachel's point about the impossible, and that is quite right, and the opportunities we've seen here are remarkable for pace of change and for doing things differently. It's really exciting. There are solutions that we can get our hands on really, really quickly. We know that people are entitled to way more money in their pockets than they're even claiming already. People don't know what they're entitled to. There's some maximising income stuff that we can do quickly. I think we can look at how we increase the amount of money available to people in emergency crisis situation, knowing that this is likely to recur. And I think a lot of the solutions are in our hands. So really, really welcome today as a way of getting our brains together and contributing to that process.
Thanks very much indeed, Becca. So some key themes coming through that, and I've just been making notes as we go along. So there's some stuff about resilience and, you know, how you deal with sudden shocks, and this is one hell of a shock at the moment for everybody, and even more of a shock for many. On the one hand, your ability then to deal with uncertainty and what lies ahead, and your ability to deal with those outside stresses, which are in any case in the environment and in your own particular environment, and they will be different for different people. So that's one issue there. Something else that's coming through the conversation so far is about how we understand both what our rights are, but also how things are working where we live and work, both, and the difference in information that we are getting, exacerbating obviously, and highlighting the situation in relation to the media in Wales. So that's another key issue there. Some really tough, practical, basic day-to-day issues for people as well. And it strikes me as well that we're obviously, you know, for many still in an emergency response phase, particularly in relation to health and social care. For others, we're in a transition, not even a transition stage yet. We're in a kind of temporary holding pattern till we know what the next thing is going to be. And part of that is the lockdown decision and when that's going to be lifted and how that's going to be lifted, crucially. And then there's going to be a transition stage after that. And then what a new normal could be, we have no idea about that yet. We just cannot imagine or conceive what that is. And there's a really interesting piece that I would recommend reading from Nesta that they put out yesterday, the innovation organisation. Well worth reading. So something about what we value, how we value it, what matters, and what matters to people being the key question as well. We've got a series of questions that have come through from participants today, so thanks very much everybody who's contributed. I've tried hard not to be diverted by the chat bar going on down the side. I'm going to start with one from Fran Target, which is this the moment to support universal basic income, UBI, based on the real living wage? And I'd like to come to you, Stuart, first on that, if I may, please.
I think broadly, yes. I think it has to be the answer. We've seen the flow of people needing to claim universal credit. We know of the issues we've had with universal credit for a long time, the 5-week wait being one of the major ones there. Actually, if government has flicked the lever and paid basic income to everybody, which can later be reclaimed from the tax system for those who are still earning and still doing well, I think that would have reduced bureaucracy, reduced the load on civil servants, and I think it, you know, I do think perhaps it's a moment where UBI's time has come. Okay. And I was also, you know, we also see, I think, parliamentarians from across the political spectrum, even in Westminster, who previously might not have gone there, picked that up. And I do think it needs to be part of the debate here.
Laura, how about you? I mean, your point was about political priorities needing to change as well, and the Overton window in terms of what's politically possible being totally bust open, and crises do that. Is this the moment for UBI?
Well, I think it's one of the things that we should be considering, but I don't think there's a single intervention that we should regard as being more significant than others. I mean, I would start from a slightly different dimension, two different tracks really. I think first of all we've got to elevate education to its proper status, and that will require a much bigger funding intervention to make schools operate in a much more imaginative way to prepare the next generation for a very different world. Yep. I think the curriculum has to be implemented faster and more expansively, with bigger emphasis on the key themes around health and citizenship and so on. And I think a great deal more money has got to go into that. So that's the kind of one thing. For me, schools are the site of every change, you know, because, you know, whilst I kind of contradicted myself and I said, look how quickly we've changed things in the middle of a crisis. But the reality is, lasting sustainable change comes generationally, and we need to equip the next generation for a very different world, and we need to start doing that now. But my point about UBI is, yes, I think it's definitely one of the components, but I think we've got to look fundamentally at our taxation system. I mean, I don't know if Steve Thomas is on the line, but Steve and I have exchanged thoughts on this. You know, I think it's a really important idea to get into public's minds that we can't have our cake and eat it. You know, if we're going to have better public services, we need to find a way of paying for them, particularly as we'll emerge, you know, into a recession, and with debt being at the level, personal and societal debt, and at the level it will be. I think we've got to think about a much more progressive tax system. Because there's a reason why countries have been able to cope without building, you know, immediate field hospitals and so on, and that's because they have better taxation systems and so on. And this is part of a new social contract, isn't it? You know, all of these things have to fit together really as parts of the jigsaw puzzle to create a new social contract between individuals. But I think UBI is on the table, but a radical reform of the tax system for me is probably the most fundamental, alongside a real prioritisation of education.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Rachel, I'm going to come to you with another question. So you talked a lot about the digital infrastructure in Wales and issues around access. So we know, and it's been even more exacerbated and highlighted, how lacking infrastructure, both digital as well as physical, can be in Wales. So a question from Kerith Rhys-Jones. What should our infrastructure priorities be in terms of public policy to support and enable everybody in Wales to access learning at all different levels? And I'm going to broaden that out beyond the education question and come to you next, Rebecca, after this.
I think one of the key priorities has to be provision of good quality Wi-Fi, but also, as I was saying, the kit to be able to access this for everybody across Wales. Because one of the big determinants about whether you can work from home is whether you've got a job that allows you to do that and whether you have adequate Wi-Fi at home. So without that, there are people who are still going into workplaces who wouldn't have to if we had better provision in terms of accessing the internet. But as I said initially, this is also an equalities issue, that if you're a family at home and you have two children who both need to be accessing Hub, for instance, in order to do their schoolwork, you've got a working parent who needs IT to be able to do their job from home. That's a lot of different facilities that people need just within one family. You may not have sufficient bandwidth to be able to do those kinds of things. So Wi-Fi is very much a key service right now. Looking to the future, then we need to be thinking about, you know, kind of bite-sized learning. Kerith at the Open University knows very well about kind of how important it is to have small bite-sized courses that get people involved in terms of getting back into learning, in terms of thinking about changing careers. But none of this is possible if we don't have families and services that mean that people can do those kinds of things. I've also seen some chat about the new curriculum, which is a positive. I think one of the things that we do need to bear in mind in terms of talking about bringing that forward is the pressure on teachers, that teachers have gone through an immense period of change in terms of schools closing face-to-face teaching and having to deal with those kinds of things. Obviously, my major concern is working in the post-compulsory education training sector. But I guess what we wouldn't want to do is to kind of make teachers feel even more overloaded in terms of having to get ready for a new curriculum when they're still expecting to do that within 12 months. So I'd kind of be a bit cautious about putting extra stress on people who, like the rest of us, are already stressed.
Yeah, one of your key points, I think, around access, I mean, we're making assumptions, and which we shouldn't be making, about the ability of parents to be able to help children. Assume you've got the kit, the ability to be able to help them. What happens if that's if the support has been provided in a language which isn't your first language? And what happens in particular in multi-generational families as well, and living together and sharing that. And that's what we're hearing from our friends and colleagues at East in particular, and some of the challenges around that. Now, Becca, I'm going to come to you, and then we're going to open up and go to the next question about food, because that's a key issue at the moment, obviously. Becca.
Yeah, I think building on what Rachel has said, I mean, I couldn't agree more in terms of access to Wi-Fi and kit. And I think I would just build on that to say that when we're thinking about infrastructure, we should think about people's knowledge and awareness as well as what we would typically consider to be infrastructure. Because for me, there's a huge disparity, and it goes hand in hand in part with the issue of equality and inequality that you so rightly raised there, Rachel, about people's awareness of what is out there for them to access, in terms of understanding what's there online. The most basic issue to many of us, that if you go online to certain trusted sources, there's a whole raft of stuff there that you can access that will help you on anything from how to claim the benefits you're entitled to resources to help you school your children at home or whatever it might be, but people don't know that those things are there. So I think infrastructure wise there is a huge and important part to be played by the media, and in terms of our communication with one another more broadly. I think one of the biggest challenges, going back to your really opening piece, Oriel, about what are the challenges, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is that there are those people who, however much infrastructure we put in place, simply will not be able to access the things that they need to access in a remote way. And in this particular form of crisis, how do we get anything done face to face that is not the very most urgent thing of keeping people alive in a hospital setting or in a care setting? So I think that is a huge challenge for the way that our infrastructure responds to this particular crisis. And then I finally would say that I think there's a huge amount here around upskilling. So supporting people to understand how they can access the resources that they need at complicated times like this in their lives. And I think that we all have a part to play in thinking about how people access that information, because a lot of it is not accessible to people at the moment.
Okay, so some really key issues coming through from that. Thanks very much, Becca. I'm going to talk now about food, because it's one thing that everybody needs. And it's something which is crucial both to obviously staying well and being healthy, and we've all been affected in different ways by how the food system over the last month has come into just really stark relief. So it's a question from Jenny Rathbone about the food system being broken. How radical do we need to be to protect, reinstate food security for Wales, including massively ramping up horticulture production? So could we come to Stuart, in terms of how your members are engaging with local economies and the well-being economy locally and supply chains? Can you talk us through some of those challenges and some of those opportunities too, please? Because I know that housing associations have been a really key nexus right across the country for both trying new things and trying things differently.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think housing associations working within communities do see themselves as anchor institutions in those communities, and actually see their role far beyond just the houses and the people that inhabit those houses in that community. They do see a wider community role. So there has been an emphasis on proactive contact and communication with tenants and others in communities to ensure that they have what they need at this time. And part of that actually is food. I think Jenny's question, the wider one about do we need to have more resilience, I guess, in Wales around our food security and gear that up. I think all these things come into the mix alongside the debate about what stimulus and resilience package looks like beyond this crisis. So whether that's onshoring the production back into Wales for vital equipment, for food, I think everything comes into the mix there. But yeah, housing associations in communities are playing a much wider role during the beginnings of this crisis than they have even previously.
That's certainly what we're hearing from the conversations with our members and partners over the last few weeks as we've been ringing round. We're hearing that there's been a really productive work cross-sector in a geographical location where people are working in very, very different ways, solving immediate problems, but that's not necessarily happening at a higher level where there's still quite a siloed conversation. Laura, you picked up on before in terms of devolution and the devolution settlement. And again, can I ask, is this an Overton window in terms of the understanding of how decisions are made? Has the devolution settlement been stretched beyond breaking point by this crisis, or is it going to be stretched even further?
Well, that remains to be seen, obviously, but I think it's certainly a moment of potential crisis. I think Stuart mentioned earlier that the weaknesses of a very asymmetrical devolution and generally aligned with the lack of profile that Wales has vis-a-vis Scotland, and for different reasons, Northern Ireland has meant that we're very much the ugly sister, let's put it like that, of the whole UK picture. So we've been mostly ignored, sometimes criticised, and sometimes rightly criticised, and largely the Welsh Government's been responsive rather than proactive in this. Now, I think there's a whole set of reasons for that, and I don't think we should be looking to blame anybody at this moment, but if ever there was a time to look at a much more strategic and sustainable model of devolution and a fit for purpose assembly particularly, then I think it's now. And going back to my point about how debate can easily become polarized, I mean, I wrote a column about this recently and was criticised for kind of giving the oxygen of publicity to the abolish the assembly guys. And by the way, they are guys. I think it's entirely valid to do that because, you know, we know that we have a population that is disengaged from devolution, that doesn't turn out in assembly elections. You know, over half of the population don't vote in assembly elections, and that probably won't change next year, although who knows now. So I think, you know, we've got a kind of an ignorant, in the best use of the term, population around what devolution can and does do. And of course, therefore, populism can enter into that space. You know, it can fill the vacuum. And if we're not careful, you know, we'll polarize into those people who kind of say, get rid of the blinking thing. It would be much easier to just have one government speaking with one voice in times of crisis like this. And I think we've got to make sure that doesn't happen. But the only way we can make sure that that doesn't happen is being very clear about what the value of devolution is and what we still need to do to make sure it's fit for purpose.
So something about what comes next, what distinctly Welsh priorities are for recovery and what that means in the communities right across the country.
Well, yeah, and you know,
the sharing of that.
And you know as well, let's give the opposition parties their head. You know, this ridiculous idea that we're all in it together and we can't criticise things that are going on around us is ludicrous. You know, this isn't a world war, as I know the UK government would like us to believe. You know, this is a political, economic and social crisis. And by bringing diverse voices to the table, I mean, you know, let's be fair, at least the Assembly has tried to meet virtually, unlike the House of Commons. We are enabling the opposition parties, all of them for that matter, to at least challenge government, and decision making should become better through scrutiny and challenge.
Yeah, so I'm just conscious, I mean, you picked up obviously on political, economic and social. We talked a lot about social issues just now. Obviously, there is a massive economic crisis, both now and we know we have some sense of the tsunami that is going to come and hit us shortly. The foundational economy has been the other thing that's had a lot of airtime lately in terms of this is the moment to be thinking about what that means. There are all sorts of pilot projects going on at the moment that are funded by Welsh Government, and there are very different understandings of what the foundational economy means and how it plays out in different ways. Rachel, you're part of the foundational economy network, aren't you? And can you tell us a little bit about what it could mean in terms of increasing prosperity and reducing inequality? A question from Elizabeth Hayward on that.
Oh, that's a big question. I'm afraid. For those people who aren't that familiar with the foundational economy, as Ariel said, there are lots of different understandings, but one of the easiest ways to understand it is the economy of everyday life. And I guess that what we would think of as the economy of everyday life has just reduced. I've seen that there's some discussion about actually, you know, how do we continue to support the economy after the current government support runs out? What happens after that? Because foundational economy services as we see them now, the kind of the healthcare, the education care, the provision of food, usually foundational economy services include things like, you know, small shops, like hairdressers, like things that we just can't access at the moment. I think the focus on Wales making sure that citizens are able to access the goods and services, the everyday things that they need, has been taken up by Welsh Government and has been given a renewed emphasis. I think the current crisis shows exactly how important that is. I'm not sure how disrupted the pilot projects that are going on in terms of foundational economy in things ranging from, you know, different types of apprenticeships, health and social care. I'm not sure how those will have been affected in the current lockdown situation, but there was certainly a lot of really positive going on there. Is somebody else getting interference on the line?
No, I'm okay. I can hear you. Carry on.
I've got some sort of radio feed going on in my background.
Okay, I'll come to Becca then on that. So in terms of the foundational economy and the support in particular for small businesses, when you're getting people contacting you, are they telling you about the kinds of things that they how they are earning their livings in particular, and are you getting a higher spike in terms of people asking for support who are engaged in small businesses?
Yeah, we're getting a huge impact in terms of, I mean, overall in terms of people coming to us around employment. So the period over the last couple of weeks, it was up around 230% on the same period last year around employment issues in general. And what's interesting about the data that we gather is that it does help you break down how many of those people are self-employed, how many of those people are employed, what kind of pages are they searching on our website. I think we will start to drill down into that granular detail around how many of those are from SMEs over the next coming weeks, because that's the basis on which we'll be able to plan for what might be the best policy interventions coming down the line. And at this point, we just don't have that level of granular detail.
And are you having conversations with, for instance, the FSB about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so we're a binational organisation across England and Wales. We're having conversations with a whole range of organisations about what are we learning. One of the benefits of the way that our system works is that we gather a huge amount of data, and that we can then deploy that in terms of assisting with policy making and just with thinking about what the future might look like. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think you've given me a good segue, thank you, into some of the issues around learning. One of the things I've been thinking about since the beginning of this, and certainly the lockdown period, is what do we do in other sectors that is just normal and par for the course? And some of you may know that I worked in international humanitarian emergencies for nearly 20 years. And some of the things that we are not doing here yet is deploying the kinds of real-time evaluations of what the emergency response is on a kind of cross-sectoral basis. And so we've been having conversations with a number of key partners, including the various commissioners and the audit office. And we're really excited to be doing something with them in a couple of weeks' time, a similar event to this, thinking about how do we capture the examples of what's really not working and what the impact of that is, as well as the examples of what is working, and how do we make sure that it's going to have stickability? How is it going to be not ephemeral and something that is just for now, but something that really we could pick up and run with further on down the line? So I think there's something about needing to both be intentional about paying attention to that kind of stuff and create a space, because if we're closing down those conversations across sectors, we're going to lose the opportunities to spot possibilities that may make a difference to real people's lives in the future. So that's something that we want to help shape a coalition, a movement, a sharing, a lot of attention, and really, really good listening to. There will be policy strands that can come out of that. But if we're all doing our own thing in our separate little worlds, then we're missing a really, really important trick. So there's something around that. I'm going to start bringing us to a close now. We're really conscious about doing this for the first time with this many people in the room, and it's great that you've been here, so thank you very much indeed. We're really conscious that there are lots of questions that we haven't got to yet, so we're going to be using those as the jumping off points for future conversations over the coming weeks and months. We don't know yet if we're going to be doing this weekly and fortnightly, but we're obviously going to be doing it again and doing it again soon. And I think we're going to be thinking also about whether, and it'd be interesting, I'm putting this out to everybody, is it more use for you to be having a deep dive into a particular sector? We think it's more useful to have something across sector. We're conscious that we haven't got anybody from the private sector here today. But we have deliberately gone for key issues around education and governance in particular, as well as inequalities, obviously, and housing, because where people live makes a difference to everything else that they can then do as a result. If you want to receive early notifications of future IWA events and recordings of all of our Rethinking Wales sessions, please join us as a member. The link will be sent out to you with this recording. It's iwa.wales, about us and support us. You get fantastic benefits, but you can also play your part in supporting an open, politically independent organisation at a critical juncture for Wales, because make no mistake, this is absolutely a critical juncture. And there are things that we must do now. We must move with speed, with pace, and the quality of our collective response must be absolutely, absolutely spot on. There is so much more that could be said, but I'm going to pause now and say thank you very much indeed, diolch yn fawr, and have a very good rest of the day. Thank you.